Chapter 5. Organization Questions. 1. Business. Listen to a lecture in a business class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Today, we're going to move on to something called the product life cycle. Just like people, products go through stages of life. You're born, you start out kind of slowly, then you mature, make your impact on the world, and then, sad, but we all die. Likewise, every product goes through a life cycle too. Soap, toys, clothes, computers, everything. As I was saying, just like human beings, a product has to be born, and that's what happens in the development and introduction phase. Two major things happen in this stage. First, the product is created, and of course, in doing so, in creating the product, the company pours a lot of money into making a prototype. Once that's done and the product is ready, advertising starts, and customers are introduced to the product concept first, closely followed by the actual product. So the product hits the market in this phase. Now, you need to understand that sales for new products, except in really rare cases, usually start out slowly. So the company needs aggressive marketing to get customers to take notice of the new product. Typically, the company is losing money on the product at this phase. So our product grows up a little and now it's a teenager, so to speak. The second phase is the growth stage, and it's kind of like being a teenager. Not quite mature, but getting bigger and better all the time. What do I mean? Well, remember in the first phase, money is typically not made on the product. But now the thing starts to make money. The product starts to stand on its own 2 feet. This stage can bring intensified demand for the product, and it begins to gain a reputation. The general public is more interested in the product because they've heard about it some. But if you think everyone is just fine in this stage and there are no problems, let me tell you something. Competition increases in this stage as other companies start to copy the product, making their own versions of it. Hey, life's tough. Moving on, when people hit their 20s, they begin to mature. The third stage is called, you got it, the mature stage. Now people recognize the product immediately, and it has an established customer base with a good long-standing reputation. This lasts for a while. It varies by product, and the company can make lots of money, typically more than in any other phases. People know the product and continue to buy it. Now, as a side note, it's important to realize that some products never reach this stage. Hey, some people never grow up, right? Well, some products are released, never become popular, and are immediately taken off the market. Now comes the sad part. Just like we humans, there's a time to, call it quits. Everything dies, including our once strong product. The final stage in a product's life is called the decline stage. Eventually, the popularity of a product has to end, and when the product becomes outdated or customers lose interest, it goes into the decline stage. The product is not worth producing anymore, so the company phases the product out.
1. How does the professor introduce the topic? 2. How does the professor organize the information she presents to the class? 3. Why does the professor mention competition? 2. History. Listen to a lecture in a history class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Okay, let's talk about an important force that helped shape American society in the 1920s and 1930s. Any guesses about what it might be? No? Well, anyone ever heard of the Charleston? How about the jitterbug? There are different kinds of dances that were popular during that era. You see, the dance halls of that time drew crowds from all over and began to shape society in a lot of different ways. Let me first give you an idea of what these dance halls were. Dance halls first cropped up in the major metropolitan areas after World War I. A lot of the dance craze was fueled by a desire to forget the war, to forget about the hard times. Big cities like Chicago, New York, Boston, and Detroit opened up huge venues where people could congregate and dance. These dance halls hosted popular bands, which helped encourage people to come. Actually, in New York, about 10% of the people joined in the dance craze once a week. Altogether, about 6 million people attended a dance hall in 1924. Now, I don't know if that sounds like many to you guys, but let me put this in perspective for you. That was just in one city. 6 million people in dance halls in one city in 1 year. That's a lot. So, what did dance halls do for culture? First, dance halls gave society a different view of entertainment. Now, I know we don't normally think of dance crazes as shaping society, but if you think about it for a minute, it's really true. Just like rock and roll affected American culture, the dance halls that started opening up in the 1920s really influenced young people's ideas of entertainment, relationships, and different beliefs. What do I mean by that? During the early 20s in the United States, a lot of people thought dancing was evil or inappropriate. They thought that it encouraged the young people to be irresponsible and reckless. But the teenagers and people in their 20s were really drawn to this form of entertainment because it was fun. So they developed different beliefs about dancing and entertainment in general. This, of course, it changed American culture. It gave people a place to go and socialize. Now, dance halls also had an effect on, what's the best way to put this? Dance halls gave people a different idea of what proper behavior was. Now, today we would think dance halls were not at all morally offensive. It was just people dancing. But it was actually rather progressive for the time. In a way, it allowed people to get away from their very proper, some would say boring lives. They got to go out and dance, to be with strangers. And I think eventually it led to the idea that such behavior was just fine, even if it was shocking for some at the time.
1. How does the professor organize the information he presents to the class? 2. Why does the professor mention World War I? 3. Why does the professor mention rock and roll? 3. Psychology. Listen to a discussion in a psychology class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
How is everyone today? Feeling good? How about happy? Angry? Most of you are just looking at me with a blank expression, wondering why I'm asking. Well, that's what we're talking about today, emotions. You see, psychologists have been fascinated with emotions for a long time because they are so complex and intricate. And one theory called the two-factor theory of emotion tried to do just that, explain how emotions are created. Anyone ever heard of it, the two-factor theory of emotion?
I've read about it. Yeah, let's see. It's a theory suggesting that emotions depend on things, two factors, and those are physiological arousal, followed by cognitive interpretation of that arousal.
Yeah, that's basically it. Exactly. To rephrase, this two-factor theory of emotion states that we need two things to feel any emotion at all. Okay, the first of these things is some sort of physical arousal, a stimulus. That's the first thing, and then second comes the cognitive interpretation part mentioned. Second, we need to interpret, in our minds, of course, we need to interpret what this physical stimulus means. Okay. So, one of the things that defines the two-factor theory of emotion is that it has a reliance on your physical state. Let me explain. You can think of different physical states, right? Like maybe your muscles are tired, maybe your hands are shaking. So you see, psychologists recorded that people sometimes perceive that they feel a certain way just because of their physical arousal. In other words, If I'm shaky and my heart is racing, I think I'm nervous. I don't take into account that I could simply be feeling the effects of all the sugar in that chocolate cake I had a while ago, okay? Does everyone understand?
I'm just not sure I see the connection between physical state and emotion. I mean, where does the mind come into it all?
Good question. You see, because you think you feel that way, like nervous for example, even though you really just ate chocolate, you actually begin to feel nervous. The emotions become real. Yeah, now you're really nervous, even if it is a false interpretation that initiates them. They called it cognitive interpretation, basically, how somebody perceives a certain event or a set of circumstances. Okay, that's the theory. But now I'd like to introduce a little surprise. Yeah, the theory is not accurate. And well, as it turned out, it seems that theory overstated the importance of arousal to cause emotions. People later learned that you do not have to have some physical arousal to feel an emotion. Think for a minute about a great day in your life. Go ahead, guys. Actually, think about it, okay? Well, I'll bet one or two of you feels happy right now, huh? Certainly, nothing aroused you physically. You just created an image in your heads. So in the end, this theory was pretty much considered not to be accurate.
1. How is the discussion organized? Two. How does the professor support the idea that physical conditions affect emotions? 3. Why does the professor mention a surprise? 4. Literature. Listen to a discussion in a literature class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Think about some of the classic literary works. Now, think about the plot and the story structure. How many of them are actually very unique stories? Not many of them. This was the point of an important literary movement called structuralism. Structuralism wasn't just predominant in literature either. It was actually a cultural movement that affected nearly all the arts and sciences: psychology, anthropology, mathematics, history, and, of course, literature. So, what is structuralism exactly? In literature, it's the idea that the most important part of any literary work is its underlying structure, not the characters, even if dynamic, not the plot itself, even if it's interesting and not the writing style, even if it's beautiful and clear. Structuralism is looking for uniqueness. So basically, if the structure of the work resembles previous works, even in the slightest way, it isn't considered noteworthy. Let's look at an example. Can anyone think of a truly unique literary work?
How about Romeo and Juliet? Think of all those interesting and complicated plot twists. That's got to be unique.
Actually, Romeo and Juliet uses a classic theme. Boy meets girl, falls in love, but there is a huge problem. Their families can't stand each other. Thus, the tragic ending. This structure is seen over and over again throughout history. For that reason, the structuralists would criticize it. A structuralist would say that it uses a formula. Understand?
Okay, I guess I can see that.
All right then. But what if the story were switched around, changed? Would it be unique then? For example, if the story were about two families that liked each other and then arranged for their kids to get married, but the kids didn't like each other, and all this leads to a tragic end, would that satisfy our highly critical structuralists?
It's completely different, so it must be unique.
Sorry, no, it would not satisfy the structuralists. It still has the same basic elements: love, animosity, and of course the tragic ending. The formula is still the same. And, by the way, structuralists have a name for this. They call it an inverse structure.
Then what are structuralists looking for exactly?
Like I said, something completely new and different without any comparisons. In structuralism, the whole goal is to reduce the story down to its basic components, the most basic structure. Then, if the structure is new and different, it becomes noteworthy. Otherwise, it's just another piece of literature. The thing all structuralism has in common, whether it is in history or psychology or anthropology or literature, is that it looks for the meaning of things in the distinctiveness of its structure. In literature specifically, though, structuralism doesn't see any value in the work unless it's unique.
1. How is the professor's lecture organized? 2. How does the professor begin her lecture? 3. Why does the student mention Romeo and Juliet? 5. Astronomy. Listen to a discussion in an astronomy class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Today we're going to get started a little differently. Do this. Imagine you're an astronomer. You've seen Saturn in a telescope, and you all have, right? You all know what Saturn looks like? Rings, yes? Okay. So you've seen the rings, but neither you nor any other astronomer in the world can come up with even the slightest clue of what they're made of. How? How frustrating would that be? Well, luckily for us, a Scottish physicist named James Clerk Maxwell finally solved the mystery in 1857. So, my fellow astronomical sleuths, what do you think the rings are made of?
Can I guess? I'd have to say they're made of solid rock. How else would we be able to see them?
Well, that's a very common guess, and that's what many thought in the past, but that's actually incorrect. So, should I go ahead and crack the mystery for you all? Okay, so this Maxwell that I mentioned a minute ago, he decided that the rings had to be made of tiny particles that orbit around the planet.
Tiny particles? Tiny particles of what?
Would you like to guess?
Oh, wow. I don't know. Well, would they be little pieces of rock?
Nope, but that's a good guess. Okay, I want you all to get this, so I'm going to help you out. Think about this. You all know that the rings are really bright, right? And they appear brighter at different points in the planet's rotation. Okay, so knowing that, what can you surmise? No one? Here's another hint. They reflect over 80% of the sunlight that hits them. Now, what material is this starting to sound like to you?
What? No, ice?
That's it. Great job. You just did in a few minutes what it took astronomers over 200 years to do. Of course, you had help. Anyway, you're exactly right about the ice. The particles are pieces of ice that range from, well, tiny to as big as a large snowball that you might make during a snowball fight. So honestly, particles is almost misleading because it makes you think of something really small. But that's what they call them. Anyway, so where do these particles come from?
Actually, before we move on to that, could you explain how they actually formed rings?
Good question. It is yet another mystery. The rings are really only about, at the most, 20 or 30 meters thick. That's very thin. So, how do they stay in such a thin pattern? Well, astronomers believe it is because the particles tend to run into each other as they orbit. After a while, they had collided so many times that they all just sort of fell into the same orbit. No one particle could stray from its own orbit because it would just be knocked back by an adjacent particle. Does that make sense? Let's move on to how they formed.
1. How does the professor organize the information he presents to the class? 2. How does the professor introduce the topic to the class? 3. Why does the professor mention a snowball fight? 6. Environmental science. Listen to a lecture in an environmental science class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Let's go back in time a few years to the 1940s. The world is at war. Yeah, World War II is being fought. Let's say you're the leader of a country that has men fighting in hot tropical areas. But here's the problem. Not only are your men fighting the enemy, they're also fighting mosquitoes. Yep, lots of your men are dying from malaria, a disease caused by the bite of a mosquito. So you look around and find this stuff, DDT, which was actually made many years earlier. But you're smart, so you figure out that this substance, DDT, also does a great job of killing mosquitoes. It's a pesticide. You spray the stuff in tropical areas right where your troops are. And yeah, the mosquitoes die. This is good, but little do you know that the pesticide DDT also has some very significant drawbacks. DDT's problems came to light pretty quickly. Though scientists knew DDT killed mosquitoes, they hadn't realized that the mosquitoes would be able to quickly adapt to the toxin through natural selection. Over time, mosquitoes quite simply became resistant to the pesticide, and the parent mosquitoes passed on this resistance to their offspring. You could spray the stuff on them and why, they'd drink it up and laugh at you. So the number of cases of malaria rose again. Really fast. And mosquitoes reproduce fast, so the entire population could acquire resistance very quickly. Pretty soon, almost all the mosquitoes were resistant to DDT. Another downside is DDT's effects on the environment, plants and animals. In terms of animals, we'll talk about birds. Many birds were exposed to the pesticide in the process of spraying for mosquitoes, and it severely weakened their ability to reproduce. Furthermore, many of the birds ate the mosquitoes with high DDT levels in their bodies. The DDT caused the eggshell of the bird's offspring to be thinner than normal, which failed to protect the baby bird until it could survive outside the egg. This was a huge problem. You know the bald eagle of North America? Well, it just about became extinct because of this. There's something else to consider. Scientists initially figured that DDT couldn't pose any real threat to the environment because it's not water-soluble. But they didn't think about the fact that it can be carried in fats and oils. So it is still possible for it to be transported to other areas. So yes, it did end up harming the environment. There's a third negative effect of DDT that we need to discuss before moving on. And well, actually, I just mentioned it in passing. Yeah, you see, this pesticide causes something called biomagnification. Basically, what this means is that the poison builds up in the animals, and the higher up on the food chain an organism is, the higher the level of DDT it takes in. Over time, the level of DDT builds up. Okay, let me explain. If an insect has some DDT in its body, and then a bird eats a lot of such insects, by the time it gets to the top of the food chain, there's a whole bunch of DDT inside the animals. It accumulates is what I'm saying. This meant that the entire food chain was affected by the negative ramifications of this pesticide, all the way up to humans. Now, despite all the many drawbacks of DDT, it did have a few strong points. Like I said, it helped reduce the incidence of malaria. Granted, in tropical areas, the number of cases rose again, but they still weren't as high as they were initially. And in countries that aren't tropical, it drastically reduced the number of cases. So yes, DDT is absolutely an effective pesticide. There's really no doubting that. It also had a positive result in that it limited the cases of yellow fever, which is another disease transmitted by mosquitoes. If it weren't for DDT, these diseases might still be causing major problems in countries around the world. Now, the cases are much more contained than they were, although they are still a big problem in some parts of the world. Okay, in most of the developed nations, DDT isn't used anymore, but a lot of countries are still using it for various purposes. So the controversy over DDT is still a major issue. However, if you look at the negative points and the positive points, my opinion is that the negative points easily outweigh the positive ones.
1. How does the professor organize the lecture? Two. Why does the professor mention World War II? 3. Why does the professor talk about biomagnification? 7. Sociology. Listen to a discussion in a sociology class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
We're going to talk about something that is pretty complex, but it's also an important part of sociology. So, the topic today will be game theory. And if you're wondering, yes, it is a theory all about games. But don't let that fool you into thinking that it isn't a very important and complex sociological theory. Anyway, let me go ahead and define the theory first. Game theory is basically just a series of observations about the way people play games. Typical games that we play like chess or sports. Game theory looks at all the possible scenarios for how a game could be played and then identifies the best course of action. That is, the best course of action if each player employs a certain strategy. So, in essence, game theory is a study of the strategies that people use in games, but it applies to real life too, to many situations, not just games. Games, then, are just a good way to see how people use strategies. Understand?
No, I don't get it. Wouldn't it just be a big list of good strategies? Where does the theory part come in?
Well, players in games use different strategies, right? I mean, a strategy has to change. Let me give you an example. If you were playing tag and two people went off to the left while only one person went to the right, the best course of action would be to go left. You know, because you have a higher chance of tagging someone. But if two people went right instead of left, the best course of action would change. The best thing you could do in that case would be to adjust your strategy and go right. So your best strategy changes according to the strategies of other players. So you can't say the best strategy in tag is to go left because that wouldn't always be true.
Okay, I understand. So game theory is really about tailoring your strategy to the strategies of other players. But what happens if you can't beat them? Only match their strategy?
Yeah, there's another theory for that. Part of game theory. The Nash equilibrium deals with, it's kind of like a different theory, but it's important to understanding game theory. Basically, when every player chooses their best strategy, there is an equilibrium, where no one has a superior advantage. This equilibrium idea had been around for a while. It was first mentioned in the early 1700s. But the equilibrium wasn't very applicable to a game theory in general until John Nash figured out how it applied more universally. Here's an example of how this applies. One of the most famous examples is called the prisoner's dilemma. Basically, the game simulates a set of interactions in a prison. Let's say two prisoners are planning to escape. The example says that they have two different choices. They can stay loyal to each other and keep the plan a secret, or they betray the other and reveal the plan in exchange for a lighter sentence. So, there are advantages and disadvantages of each choice. So, you can't really say that one is better than the other. The equilibrium is achieved if both decide to betray the other. Neither choice has adverse consequences, and neither prisoner is really affected by the betrayal. On the other hand, if only one of the prisoners betrays the other and is caught, negative consequences ensue. The first prisoner, the one that committed the betrayal, has the upper hand.
What if neither of the prisoners betray the other? Like if they both stay loyal. Isn't that equilibrium too?
Actually, the theory says that what you're describing isn't equilibrium because as long as both stay loyal, there is the fear of betrayal. The situation is completely unstable. They're probably both wondering if each prisoner is going to betray the other. So really, there's the possibility that they'll change their strategies at any time. Both prisoners opting to betray is completely stable, and stability is key to the Nash equilibrium. Now, not all of these little games have a Nash equilibrium, only some of them. The Nash equilibrium is really useful in analyzing the way that people react to things. For example, in sociology, we use it to help predict how people will respond to different actions on the parts of the people around them. You see, these games are not just about the game. They really are about people and understanding them.
1. How does the professor organize the information in the lecture? 2. How does the professor explain game theory? 3. How does the professor introduce the Nash equilibrium? 8. Education. Listen to a discussion in an education class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Where does the responsibility for the student's learning fall? On the student or the teacher? This question has been debated in education, well, probably about as long as education has been around. I remember sitting in a class one day, wondering why I wasn't learning anything. Then I looked down at my notebook. It was covered in doodles. You know, those little drawings that students make in their notebooks when they're bored. So why wasn't I learning? Simple. I hadn't been paying attention. I closed my notebook and made sure I didn't get distracted. And I started actively listening to the teacher and even questioning her. By the end of class, I had learned quite a bit. I will never ever forget that day because it finally hit me that I had a part to play in my education. With that said, let's get into it. Now, one of education's long-standing ideas is the banking concept. Basically, this reinforces the idea that children need to be taught lots of facts in order to deposit knowledge into them. The teacher, of course, is responsible for this.
But if I don't pay attention, like you were saying earlier, then it's not the teacher's fault. I'm not learning, it's mine. It doesn't make sense for the teacher to be held completely accountable for the education of the students. I mean, it would kind of bother me to not have a part to play in my own education.
I know what you mean, and that's exactly why this idea, this banking concept, is not accepted by everyone. So that was the old theory. Now for the new, and this is my main point today. I will start with a man named Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian teacher who made a name for himself by examining and contesting this concept. He published a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Pedagogy means teaching methods, by the way. In his book, he tried to combat the idea that students are just inactive subjects for the teachers to shape however they wished. Instead, he wanted teachers to relinquish this idea in favor of another, that students should learn interactively. He also wanted to emphasize that the teacher should facilitate learning, but not completely take it over.
I thought I had heard of someone else, other than this Freire guy. I mean, talking about students participating in their education. I can't remember his name.
You're right. There are others. But Freire is the man who really put all of this, the notion of active participation on the part of students in their own learning. He put all this into a comprehensive volume dedicated to the subject. He made it apply to modern education instead of past methods of education. And he added another aspect to the idea too. He felt that the typical teacher-student relationship hampered learning. I'm talking about the whole authority thing, you know, I'm the teacher, I'm in charge, obey me. He wasn't into that. Nope, he wanted the authority structure abolished and replaced by a different one, where the teacher is also a student and the student is also a teacher.
I don't think that would work very well. I mean, how could the class even progress?
Well, he thought that if both the teacher and the student had dual roles, the educational experience would be more enriching for both parties. Really, he wanted the whole relationship to be about learning from each other. I have to tell you, I actually learn a lot from you guys. I don't use a method completely compatible with Freire's ideas, but I do use parts of them. For example, I let you guys present your semester projects to each other and discuss them and ask questions. Why do you think I do this?
To see if we know what we're talking about.
Well, partially I admit, but mostly because a lot of times you guys are your own best teachers. I mean, you learn well from each other, and you also learn the most when you're preparing to teach your peers. I learn things from you guys when I listen to your projects that I never would have known if I had done all the research, because you think differently than I do. So it is beneficial for all of us. Remember that when you present those projects next week.
1. How does the professor introduce the idea that students are partially responsible for their own educations? 2. How does the professor organize the information in her lecture? 3. Why does the professor mention the presentation of semester projects? 9. Biology. Listen to a lecture in a biology class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Today I want to talk to you about the importance of genetic diversity in animals. If a population of animals is said to be genetically diverse, that just means there is a great variation in the genes of that species. Typically, very large populations of animals show genetic diversity, while smaller populations do not show such great diversity. Genetic diversity allows animals to adapt to changes in an environment, to build up resistances to diseases. We'll discuss that more in a second. It actually affects a lot of different systems in animals, especially the reproductive process. One of the most prevalent concerns scientists have regarding endangered species is their lack of genetic diversity. Many animal species are now either threatened or endangered, which, of course, leaves a much smaller number of animals to reproduce and continue the species. At first, a reduced population isn't too much of a problem, in terms of genetic diversity at least. But eventually, all the animals start to have the same genetic lineage, so they are lacking the introduction of new genetic material. Basically, the old material just gets recycled over and over again. So what, then, is the effect of reduced genetic diversity? There are many, actually. First, animals are more susceptible to disease when the gene pool is reduced. When there's little genetic diversity, usually when different strains of viruses or diseases hit, the species survives through its eclectic mix of genetic material. The diversity enables them to survive because there are usually some families of animals that are more tolerant of the disease than others. These animals survive and then reproduce, which passes this immunity on to the others in their species. If there isn't a wide variety of genetic diversity, and they all have the same characteristics, they will also all have the same weaknesses. This puts the species in danger of complete extinction by a single particularly potent disease that they don't have a resistance to. This susceptibility gets worse as the genetic diversity decreases, meaning that the problem gets worse with every generation. The originally unique genetic material gets, watered down. To move on to another negative effect, because of this lack of genetic diversity and the subsequent watering down of the original genetic information, the animal's offspring are born with more deformities. The genetic information gets corroded. Let me explain that. Without a source of new genetic material, the body has fewer options when it is forming. Instead, the genes recombine in defective ways, producing multiple genetic problems. A good example is the Cocker Spaniel. These animals have such a lack of genetic diversity that many of them experience a variety of health problems as a result. These health problems in animals with a lack of genetic diversity are not always very obvious. The defect can be as simple as a higher disposition toward heart problems or arthritis. But in any case, the animal's genetic integrity is weakened. Okay, let's see. I know I was going to make a third point. Oh yes, all of these problems affect the overall population viability. If the entire species has such a lack of genetic diversity that they are in poor health, that puts the whole species at risk. All of the factors I've already mentioned, well, those factors make for a pretty poor outlook for the survival of the species. The susceptibility of the animals to disease makes them prone to widespread population wipeouts. Their compromised physical health means that many of them die before reaching old age, and the deformities cause a large number to die shortly after birth, or while still really young. So the entire population is threatened by the lack of diversity. The whole situation is really pretty sad. So, how about an example of how all of this information applies to a specific animal? One species that is battling these problems are cheetahs. These animals are rare in the wild and have been bred in captivity for many years. But because the overall number of cheetahs is so small, they have a severe lack of genetic diversity. Scientists actually estimate that as many as 80% of all cheetahs have the same genetic material. That's a lot. Really a lot. These animals face all of the physical problems associated with this too. In fact, their problem is so bad that cheetahs have a difficult time successfully reproducing at all. Their reproductive organs have been weakened by the limited genetic information.
1. How does the professor organize the information he presents to the class? 2. How does the professor organize his point about disease? 3. How does the professor explain his point about population viability? 10. Art history. Listen to a discussion in an art history class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
In the 14th century, the populations of Europe and Asia were profoundly affected by the Black Death, which was a disease that killed millions of people. But of course, here you all sit in an art history class, so I'm going to talk about the Black Death's effect on art. Whereas before this time, art had been more unrealistic, the art after the horror of the Black Death reflected a new attention to the reality of life, no doubt brought on by the amount of tragedy the people had witnessed. Yes, Robert?
Just an observation, but you would think the people at that time would want to escape the sad reality of the Black Death in their art and culture.
Well, with the Black Death, the entire population of Europe dropped by, like, a third. 1 out of every 3 people died from this sickness. Hard to believe. And the ones that lived, well, these people, were either feeling guilty that they had survived, or maybe they just thought about what death meant more often. They became religious, and they were obsessed with the death they had seen. Actually, that's one of the hallmarks of art immediately following the Black Death. It has a morbid quality that just hadn't been seen before. Never before was an entire generation of artists so completely captured by death and tragedy.
What do you mean? What was so morbid about their work?
Well, to start out with, a lot of the colors were extremely somber. Black, greens, and occasionally dark blues were the overriding colors, and even normally bright colors like yellow, when they were used, which was rarely, were toned down and made more, gloomy, I guess. Second, most artists included representations of death or death scenes in their art. A really famous artist of the time, Francesco Traini, created a painting called The Triumph of Death, where 3 coffins are being viewed by a group of people. Inside are bodies that are decaying as the people look on. In another corner, a Grim Reaper sort of character, a witch with a big blade used to kill her victims, is overtaking people in another group, people who are just going about their daily lives. The painting is, of course, reminiscent of the Black Death, and it shows how each member of society was affected by it. It even appeals to the emotions, evoking a depth of sorrow because the Black Death so unexpectedly killed so many. Now, let's move on to Giotto, another Italian artist, who tried to make things appear as realistic as possible. So realism can be understood as the third effect of the Black Death on art. Giotto showed similar themes as other artists of the day, death and dying of course, but he added this idea of realism. In particular, he showed real emotion on people's faces and in their gestures. This wasn't really done too much before Giotto. Anyway, because of this, he is considered to be one of the artistic fathers of the early Renaissance painters. Okay, onwards to the final effect of the Black Death on the art of the day. An entire new school of art appeared, and it was called the art of dying, well, when translated into English anyway. These works, I should add, had a real purpose. The paintings and often the woodcuts, when you carve a design into a wooden block and then creating an image by pressing the inked block onto a piece of paper. Well, anyway, the purpose of these was to show, how can I put this? Well, really, the purpose was to show people how to die well.
How to die well? That sounds, kind of strange. I mean, how does one die well anyway? I don't quite understand what you mean.
Well, to understand any type of art, you need to put it into its historical context. And in this case, remember that Christianity was the dominant religion in Europe. So when I say these works from the Art of Dying school offered advice on how to die well, I simply mean that they reflected the Church's outlook on death, and in particular, life after death, and how to get to heaven.
1. How is the lecture organized? 2. Why does the professor discuss the colors in art after the Black Death? 3. Why does the professor mention the church?